Hey YouTube, I'm going to try and get some planing done here. It poured yesterday, it poured, what was it, Sunday. Saturday was the only day I was able to get over here and do anything. I got so much work to do to get done, and I can't do the work I need to do in the rain all the time. So I'm going to work on doing some of this while it's not raining. But you can see it doesn't look good. It looks okay over there, but not too good there. Our weather's coming from Canada right now, so those guys must be suffering up there. So, Aurora Borealis, I hope you guys are staying warm. Hey YouTube, so I want to talk to you for a minute about the planer and how you go about using it to get the best cuts and stuff out of it. And a couple of little things you ought to know. First of all, I'm only talking about this planer, Porter cable planer that Lowe's sells, okay? I really like that thing because I think it's designed to be self-surviving. First of all, it can only cut, the maximum cut you can take with it is 1/8 of an inch. Okay, so let me just talk about this for a minute. Now, we're looking at this end of a board. The board would run out that way. Okay, so we're talking about this edge here, mainly where the grain would be. Now, here's the thing. When you put a rough cut board in, and you're going to plane that thing, what you need on your mind is that the planer, this particular planer, not all planers are the same, but I'm talking about this Porter cable planer. You have to imagine yourself that the table and the cutters are parallel to one another, and no matter where you set them, whether it's 1/8 of an inch, well, it wouldn't be 1/8, it would have to be bigger than that. Let's say whether it's 1/2 inch or whether it's 5 inches, you have to believe that these two things are parallel to one another. So that's the table and the cutter blade that's up inside there, okay? So with that in mind, don't think about anything else, just think about that. Okay, so then, if you put a piece of wood in here, I'll try and draw this on this so it's sort of straight. If you put a piece of wood into the planer, and that's the table, and let's say that the cutter blade is right here. As you lower the cutter, what you're doing over there is, I try to cut 1/16 of an inch. So I'm going down to the point where the edge of the metal that allows you to, the guide on the planer, allows you to put the board in. As long as you're within 1/8 of an inch, the feed rollers inside the planer will pull the board in. But here, I want to talk about putting the boards in and getting the best you can from your board, not just talking about the planer. So if you put a flat blade or flat board in there, the planer is going to cut whatever you set it at, and it's going to cut that off there fairly straight. Okay, so you might end up with, say you take that much off of the board. So if you have the board planed, and the planer has hit the board all the way down the length of the board, and the board, the surface is flat, and it feels smooth to you all the way down, that's when it's time to turn the board over. Okay, you want to turn it over. Alright, so then when you take and you turn that board over, what you're doing is you have a perfectly flat bottom, okay, on that stainless steel table that's there. You have a flat bottom. Okay, so now when you go to cut this would be the end grain here. When you go to cut this, you're going to be cutting whatever you need to get down to 3/4 of an inch. Let's say 3/4 is what you're getting at, and because that's what I'm getting at. So I want to have 3/4 of an inch on this edge. So I'll work the head of the planer down until the little gauge says that I'm down in there 3/4 of an inch, okay? Or whatever the gauge is set at. You have to look at yours because they're adjustable. Okay, so then I cut this down to 3/4. Now let's say that the board started off as 1 inch. I took an eighth off of it. That left me with 7/8. Okay, and I need another eighth to be able to go down to the size 3/4 inch board I need. Well, if I started off with 1 and I took off an eighth, I have 7/8. Now I have 7/8, so to get down to 3/4, I need to take another eighth off of that. Okay, an eighth of an inch. Now that planer can cut pretty much to the nearest 16th, even 32nd of an inch, depending upon how long your board is, how much stress you're putting on it. But let's talk about eighths of an inch. All right, so I put the board through and I set it to cut the maximum cut, which is an eighth of an inch on this planer. So let's say it cuts a nice straight eighth of an inch cut. Okay, I still need to go down. Let's see, 7, 8, 6, 8. Yeah, let's say I go down half of a cut, a 16th. I go down a 16th. I measure it. I'm still a little thick, so I want to go down another 16th, which would be an eighth of an inch, to give me that 3/4. That's the basics. That's what we're trying to do. And as long as you have a cut all the way down through it, and it's touched the board and it's made a flat surface, you'll end up with a darn close 3/4 of an inch board, the length of the board. Now, when you're working with the planer, you want to make sure that the board's not going to come out and hang down too hard on the planer, and it's not going to be too hard to pick up on the end that you're infeeding. You'll get a hang for that if you build a table for yourself, a long table. That would work even better. I work right by the mill there, so I want to do it the way I am doing it. All right, but here's where the problem comes in. Let's say this is the surface, which is nice and flat, of the planer. I got to get some more pens one of these days. So the planer is right there, the stainless steel part, and your head, you're going to adjust it to whatever. But let's say your board looks like this. Let's say it's cut badly this way. Okay? Alright, so you can see the blue line is the planer, but the board is cupped like this. What I do with that is, instead of trying to run the board in this way, what I do is I turn that board upside down so that I run it in the opposite way. And what that means is that I basically have this. I have a high spot here and a high spot there. Now I'm trying to make this 3/4 of an inch thick. Now I'm starting off with a 1 inch board, so depending upon how big that crown is, I may or may not be able to get my 3/4 inch board out of this. But in most cases I've been able to, simply because I stack the wood as soon as I cut it in the kiln. But here's my point. When you put these down on the flat part, you have the widest part of the board laying on something that's supporting it. Okay, so you put it through the planer, and let's say the planer cuts the top of this off here. Okay, so in other words, you can see that it's not cut on both sides, but it's cut in the middle. Now you can do one of two things. You can run it through there again, and hopefully you have 3/4 of an inch from here to here yet. Okay, or you can turn it around, turn the board upside down like this. So in other words, it's going to look like that. And then you can use that flat spot that you made here as a place to rest the board down on the stainless steel bed that's on that planer. And then what will happen is, you run this through here, you're going to be cutting this edge off here. Okay, these 2 points. Okay, so now you have two flat spots. Think of a railroad track where, you know, you have one rail here and one rail there. This helps you to get this to be flat. Okay, so now the next cut that I make, this is the first cut, this is the second cut. The next cut I would make is I would take it and flip the board over again so that I have two flat spots on each side, okay? And don't forget the middle of this is going to be flat in here because that's what we've already got. Now, I'm not drawing this to scale, so just try and bear with me. So we're assuming we still have 3/4 of an inch in there. So now we have these two flat sides. We're going to put them down. We're going to run those through the planer. Now let's say that the planer cut that all the way off like this, and we still had that 3/4 inch in the middle of board to play with here, okay? And you can do this, it all depends, because don't forget, we have 1/4 of an inch to play with. We have 1-inch boards that are dried. At the most they go to 7/8, but they're usually 1 inch thick, okay? They've hardly lost anything in their thickness. 1 inch thick, so that gives 1/4 of an inch for us to fool around trying to cut off the cupped part of the board so that we can end up with 3/4. So 1/4 of an inch difference gives you, at the minimum, 4 1/16 inch cuts that you can make one side or the other of this board until you finally end up with a board that's flat on the top, 3/4 of an inch thick and flat on the bottom. That's the goal for me when I'm taking wood out of the kiln and trying to make a nice board. Okay, if the edges are a little off, I'm not caring about the edges at this point because I can resaw the board later if I have to. But what I'm after is flat and the same thickness all the way through. Now with that planer from Porter Cable, from what I can see, you can trust that planer, at least the one I have you can. I've read some articles where guys had them, you know, problems with them. I think they cause their own problems, but that's beside the point. The point is you're after this straight flat board. And if you have a cup in the board, that's one way of handling that, okay? Alright, just remember you have that 1/4 of an inch to play with. That's your whole key, that 1/4 of an inch. Alright, so then let's say, now we're looking at the length of a board. Let me see if I have any more markers here. Alright, so you're looking at the length of a board now. And the board may go something like this. Let's say the length of the board, okay? Now, again, you have a whole inch here to work with when you're working with rough sawn lumber. So when I put that through there, I have to have faith in the planer that it's going to cut whatever it's telling me the setting is. If I'm cutting at 1 inch, okay, let's say I'm cutting 1 inch here, or whatever setting I have to watch that I don't cut so much off here that I don't end up with 3/4 in here. So that means that my cut on this side here can be no more than 1/8 of an inch. Now the way I have that drawn here might not look like 1/8, and I'm just drawing freehand here. So let's say we take 1/8 of an inch, or 1/16 of an inch. Let's say we take 1/16 of an inch off of this thing here with a cut off this board lengthwise. Okay, you see how it starts to take the top of that hump out. Now this board's laying in here like this, just so you know. Okay, that's how that board would be laying in there. So you're trying to get this hump that's in here out of there. Okay, so you set the planer up here to give yourself a little bit of a cut, like 1/16 of an inch. You pull down there, it cuts 1/16 of an inch off, and maybe you didn't touch this board yet here. Okay, you put it through again with the same same side, down with the hump up. And then you go down another 1/16. And that 1/16 will bring you to a clean, normally, a nice clean board all the way down. Okay? Now that means you've taken 1/8 of an inch off that board. You still have another 1/8 of an inch that you can take off the opposite side. Now 1/8 of an inch might not seem much, but when you have the wood in your kiln and you have it stickered properly, you're not going to be off all that much flat-wise with the boards. You know, they may warp here or there or something, and that's what you have to contend with. Sometimes I end up with a board that is not 3/4 of an inch thick. What I do with those is I take them right down to 1/2 inch, and I use those for drawer sides. Because the sides of drawers, inside drawers, they're never more than 1/2 of an inch thick. So that's what I would use that for. So then, anyway, getting back to what I said, one cut, we took some of the hump off. Second cut, we had a nice plane all the way down through. So now you flip the board over. You know that this top is now on the bottom and it's going to be flat. So now you can run the planer, run it through the planer, and what you can do is take a 1/16 off, and maybe you'll miss that middle. Okay, then you're going to take another 1/16, and hopefully you're going to hit that middle, so that you end up with a nice 3/4 inch thick board. Okay? Now if you have questions about this, you can write them in the comments if you want to. Alright, so that's the lengthwise. Now I had a board out there, and you'll see on the video that I'm about to show you, the board apparently went through the sawmill when the blade was dull. Okay, I had a dull blade, let's say. So here's the thing. Instead of having a nice straight cut, what I had was, let's say, a series of these. An up and down, like wavy cut. Okay? That would be the same thing as the board I just got done talking to you about. Okay? So you're going to run that through there, taking a 1/16 off of the one side. If, when you take a 1/16 of an inch off of there, you already end up with a flat board all the way down, all the way across the width, there's no need to cut any more wood off of that. As long as it's flat, lengthwise and crossways, and you have to trust that the planer's doing that. There's no way you can adjust this planer to do differently than that, okay? So trust that the planer is going to keep that parallel distance from the bottom to the top of the board. Alright, so if you have a wavy cut, now if it's really bad and the saw blade went crazy, dipping and diving, that's one thing. But if you're off 1/8, in other words, when you put my straight edge on, I could see a little light underneath it here and there. You can plane that out of there in a lot of cases, up to 1/8 of an inch. Now you could go probably 3/8 off of one side, as long as you don't have to take 1/8 of an inch off the bottom side. You can only take 1/8 or 1/16 of an inch. So when I get these type of boards, I'll put the wavy part up, run that through the planer first, and then see what it looks like. See how far away from a planed board I am. If I have a little bit of unplaned wood here and a little bit of unplaned wood there, I'll put it through again, taking another 1/16. Now that still leaves me with, 1/8 of an inch to take off the opposite side. And sometimes you have to take, 3/16 and only have 1/16 on the opposite side. It depends on how close it is. One of the things you could do is take a 1/16 of an inch cut off the top, flip the board over, and take another 1/16 off the bottom, and just to see if you got that 1/16 or not. Okay, not to see if you got the 1/16, but to see if you've got a full cut on one side, the full width. Because a lot of times, let's say I changed the saw blade, or the saw blade hit something in between cutting boards. This may be really nice and straight down here, and maybe I hit something and the saw blade started going wavy on the top on me. That's no reason to throw the board away. You can use the planer to help you to save these boards. That's the purpose of doing this stuff by hand. Okay? you're putting it through there and you're trying to get it so that every board comes out as nice as it can be. Okay, that's what I'm talking about. Okay, so that's lengthwise. Now, same thing, like, let's say the board is cupped, but instead of being cupped in the middle, let's say it's cupped on one edge, kind of. Okay, so it's cupped on one edge there, like this. I know it's not the best of drawing, but I'm just saying. Alright, so what would I do there? Well, in this case, I'd flip this over and put this end down so I get this point and this riding on that bed, because it gives me a wider stabilized board. Because if not, if I take this and put this down, I'm liable to end up with a crooked cut. The planer will cut it straight, but the board will be crooked to the side. It won't be a 90. So I'm trying to keep as close to a 90 as I can. So in that case, like I say, I would take and put the board in there like this. Oh, let's see, it would be like that. Okay, I would put the board in the planer like this, rather than like that. Okay, so then once I plane my 1/8 of an inch out of there, okay, I still have 3/4 of an inch board left to be able to cut, because I've got, or not I have a 3/4 inch board left. If I take an 1/8 out of here, I have a 7/8 inch board here yet in thickness. Okay, so I can still take another 1/8 of an inch off the opposite side then to get that thing straightened out. Now, this is not exactly easy to do. You have to have a good eye for this, because if you're not watching what you're doing and you're just throwing boards through the planer, you're going to end up with having boards that are mainly not 3/4 of an inch thick, because you're going to take too much off of one side, and once you get down below 3/4 of an inch thick, whether it's here or on the ends, that's it, your board's done. You're going to have to take it down to the next size. And I like to try to keep them at 3/4. So that's just, you know, a little hint on how to keep them straight like that. In the video, as you're watching the video, you'll see where sometimes I look at the board, I'll pick it up to my eye, I'll look down it to see where the problem seems to be. If a board is twisted, in other words, if this was a board and this is high and this is high, and the board's been twisted, you have to look at that good to see how you can get it through there to get a flat cut, until you can find out if you have enough board left to get a 3/4 inch board out of that. Now, I keep saying 3/4 because that's what I'm shooting for. It doesn't matter if you want 1 inch, 1/2 inch, 2 inch boards. It doesn't matter. This same principle comes into play when you're planing the boards. Now here's something that I don't know if you realize this. When they have an industrial planer, let's say you have a board that has a crown in it like this, okay? That industrial planer has feed rollers in there that are pressing this down so hard that it actually flattens the board out, and when it does, it causes a crack in here, okay? It causes a crack. Now, when they plane that out of there, when they push this down and they plane, like let's say they plane 1/8 of an inch off of each side, okay, to get down to 3/4. The board will be 3/4, but as soon as it comes out the end of the planer, it's going to go back into the shape of the cup that's in the board. And that's why you find boards at the store with cups in them, a lot of them, because the machine they're using doesn't take a little at a time. It does it one time and it's done. It cuts all 4 sides at once and then it's finished. But the pressure that it puts on there can crack the board open, and then when the board gets relieved out of the planer, it closes the cut or the crack back up, but you still have a crown in the board. That's why doing this the way I'm doing it, or the way any of you guys would do it that are doing it, you know, custom cutting, custom planing, is when you can look at the board and determine this stuff. Now, the first time I cut boards, I was cutting them 7/8 of an inch, and I found out that 7/8 does really not give you enough to plane when it comes to any kind of defect. And it's not so much that the boards are not straight the lengthwise. What I find is sometimes, even lengthwise, like let's say there's a series of knots somewhere in here, this board may maintain the thickness but have a bump in it, or it might even have a low spot in it. You know, it all depends on how it's dried and what's there, what's in the board. You got to remember, wood does not all grow the same. Wood has different grains, different knots, all kind of different things about it, and that's the beauty of wood, that difference. That's what people pay so much for when you see them buying, you know, a tabletop for $20,000 or whatever. I've seen advertised on YouTube. Of course, I would never pay that, but I'm just saying. So if you understand what I'm getting at, you can cut this same cup out of the board and not lose the thickness because you're working with 1/4 of an inch leeway, whereas at the factory, they're just running that through there, and that machine's big enough and heavy enough and strong enough that it's going to push the board flat, cut off so much, and the board comes back out. And if there was a crown in or cup in it to start off with, you're still going to have a cup when you're done. Now, I'm not saying this is an absolute. I'm saying that this is what, you know, can happen with some of these boards. So when you're custom planing, you can avoid some of that. It's the same thing like I said when I showed you, you know, a rounded on one edge and flat on another. And sometimes if the boards are really bad, like I had one that had a pith down the middle, if you looked at the end of the board, the pith was right down the middle here. The only thing is that the pith was so big, it's like a corky kind of wood, that it actually came through and you could see it here and here. So there was a crack down through there because that's not really, it's not hard, it's not wood, it's not the inner wood, it's just has like a sappy center to it, the pith. So it cracked the board there, okay, both sides, so you can cut, you know, that off on each side to end up with two clear boards that are quarter sawn for all intents and purposes. So it all depends on what you're looking at when you go to cut. It's the same thing with when you have a full length board. Okay, here's my 1 outfeed roller, here's the planer, and here's the infeed roller. Now, when I first set them up, all three of these are even on the top. Well, what happens if you put a board in there that's bent like that? Even though it's 3/4 of an inch thick, or an inch thick, and you'll get at this point right here, you only have about that much of a distance to work with. Right at this point, it'll take that board even on a curve, and it'll still cut it down to 3/4 of an inch from a 1-inch board as you lower the table. But when you go through here, because you have this bend, it appears that it's off of the outfeed roller. And it is off the roller, but it's not off the roller because they're not set right. It's off the roller because the board is warped. Now what happens if, when you're working with this thing, you're trying to put a board in there and it's cupped in such a way that you still need to put it in, but it's sort of bent like this. Well, as you put this through here, and as you start feeding out of the planer, that board may end up hitting the roller as it comes out the planer, okay? Or, if not that, let's just say that's one thing could happen. On this side, depending upon where this cup is and how, or this, you know, warp is and how close it is from here to here, you might end up with the board getting really tight as it tries to go through the planer in the center. So what you need to do is keep your eye on that. So in other words, you're starting off, like say you're going through the planer right at this point, At this point, you're going to start through the planer, and you're setting the table so that you're going to cut 1/8 of an inch off of it, okay? But because you have a bend in the board, like a bow in the board, what's going to happen is, as this rolls on this infeed, it picks this up a little bit here. And the higher this goes, there's a guard on the Porter cable that won't allow you to go in there with more than 1/8 of an inch to cut off. This could dig in anywhere along here that it wants to, depending upon what you have. So you may have to take some tension off of the planer to get the board to go through the first time. But either way, if you have to take some tension off, you can run it through and try and get this bow to relax a little bit. Now you're not going to take it all out, but you might be able to get it to relax a little so that you can get the board through the planer. Now if you notice that it's humped up, you might be better off taking it out of the planer and flip it over and leave the curve go this way through the planer, because it'll go through the planer a lot easier curved this way than it will this way. And the reason I'm saying that is because the planer edge won't dig into this board when you're coming in this way like it digs into the one that's, that's higher. Okay, so I don't know if you're getting what I'm saying here altogether, but it's not really that hard. And if you have one of those planers that I have, a Porter cable planer, and you keep track of it, what you're doing there with the planer, you'll see that they're a very good planer for longevity, only because of the way it's designed. You cannot cut more than 1/8 of an inch. Now, like with my Grizzly planer, the way that's designed, the rollers that feed it, that are inside the head, are on springs. So you can put a thick board in there, take an extra thick cut out of that, and it'll still run through the planer. But with the Porter cable, it won't run through the planer because, like I say, they designed that thing to be self-surviving. They really did a good job on that planer. And right now, I've cut over 7,000 board feet with that planer. And as long as there's no nails in that thing, you get some good life out of those cutting blades. So, anyway, I hope that this helps to explain that. Let's see, so we talked about cupped boards. We talked about boards that are warped. Sometimes like they're twisted. Just take a little cut at a time to find out which side will give you the flattest surface. The sooner you get to a flat, smooth surface, width-wise, the full width and the full length, the sooner you want to turn the board over. But like I was saying there, that railroad track, what I call it, effect, I like cutting these boards this direction with the cup facing up, okay, the concave side facing down, so I can flatten this out here to make sure that that board's going to stabilize itself as it goes through the planer. Now there will be times when you're running boards through there, and like say if it's twisted where you're trying to get through the planer and all of a sudden the guide that's on the edge of the table, there's a guide there, won't let you go through the planer because the board's twisted or cupped in such a way that the wood is catching onto this lip up here. But either way, I still like that, even though it catches sometimes and I gotta walk back around to readjust the head. I like it because it's not going to destroy itself, okay? I mean, when you hear that thing laboring, it's only taking 1/8 of an inch. It's not taking more. And from what I've seen, if it cuts red oak and cherry 12 inches wide and doesn't flip the breaker, what more can you want out of that planer? Right now I think they're $300. I'm not promoting the planer here. I'm trying to tell you how to use that planer to cut the boards to your benefit. So as of right now, the boards that were on the top of my pile, those are the boards with the least amount of weight on them. So like I had cut some 3x3s there, or 2 3/4 by 2 3/4, whatever they were. They had a little bit of a twist or bow or bend to them. I can still use them because I'm going to cut them short for table legs. You know, a 16-inch table leg or 18-inch table leg, they'll be fine for most of that stuff. So I just run it through, even though it might be crooked or it might be on a, you know, bowed, I still run it through there until I maintain that, you know, 2-inch thickness or whatever it is that I want on both sides. So, you know, I think it's good for that. So in my opinion, this is something that I think, you know, if you watch what you're doing with that little planer, you can save yourself money and you can get yourself a lot of wood sawn. I don't know, you know, if you watch my channel, my idea behind the sawmill was to make it pay for itself by not buying red oak trim, and it did that, and now the sawmill is working for basically for free for me. Now, of course, you know, free, you got to watch how you use that word, because I still use gas, I still need blades, you know, I still need to maintain it. But it's not the same that it costs when it was brand new and possibly a person's making payments on it or something. You know, it's kind of like a car. If you're driving an old vehicle, basically what you're paying for, you know, I mean, in order to replace it, you need to add these numbers in, but what you're paying for is, you know, the wear and the tear. You're paying for the tires and stuff like that, but you're not paying for on the payment. So you don't include the payment on what it costs you to drive your car every mile, like what you would do with a new car to figure out how much it costs you to operate it. But anyway, this is what I'm saying about these boards and this planer. If you watch what you're doing with it and you get a hang of how to run the thing through and the board through, and you have patience, you can end up with a lot of nice looking boards, and it just takes you a little extra time to do it. Now, if you're trying to make money at this, you might not want to spend that much time doing those boards like that. For me right now, I'm cutting these boards, and I'll get my money when I go to sell the board. Now, I may lose a couple bucks over the amount of time it takes me to plane or whatever, but I keep track of the wood themselves, because the wood itself, let's face it, no matter how fast I cut or how slow I cut, you can only get so much money for the wood, because the market, you know, wood is a commodity. The market decides what wood is worth, and then that's what you have to pay that day for it. So, best thing to do is cut it and sell it on a day when wood is as high as it can be. But I'm just saying, you know, as far as running it through, that's what you want to do. You want to try and get the first side, the flattest looking side, or the side that's going to be closest to being flat, through the cutter of the planer first, so you don't take any more wood off of the board than you have to. And then once you do that, then you flip it over. You know, you have whatever, if it took you a 16th because you had a nice flat board, and now you have to take 3/16 off the other side, whatever. What I try to do is, if I have a really nice flat board, and let's say there's some knots in it or some other imperfections, what I'll do is I'll run it through the one side, see if it's flat all the way through, flip it over, take 1/8 of an inch. I still have 1/16. I still have 7/8 of an inch left, and then I'll determine which side of the board is the worst looking side, and that's the side I'll take the rest of the wood off of. So it's really hard for me to talk when I have the planer going, and I am not spending 3,000 bucks for a camera with a microphone, not yet anyway. So, you know, I'll either have to shut it off, but I know in the video I do some talking and it's hard to hear me, so I decided to make this as an addendum to the video so that you could understand what I'm talking about here with when I was doing the, you know, the actual planing, that you're going to see mixed in with this little bit of a lecture. Okay guys, have a good one. Guys, I get different questions and comments on planing, and let me just give you some insight here. if you look at that board there, just hold on a second. Now this piece of red oak I'm putting on here, this is pretty straight. Now if you look at that, you can see that there's a crown in that board. But if you measure, and I don't have a tape on me, but if you look here, this little bit that's on each side, you can take the middle down and have this board flat instead of having the crown in it. Now whether it stays like that or not, you can't always tell. But the idea behind what I'm doing is to try to get the best looking board out of this wood that I can. So you see on the bottom there, it's like a set of railroad tracks. You got a touch here, touch there, nothing in the middle, okay? But it's a lot less that you need to get off on this side than you need to get off on this side. So that's why you see me turning the board in there. I turn the board to get the best flatness board that I can get. Now, you know, if you're making furniture and you're putting the wood in there a certain way because you've already cut it to size and, you know, you need to flatten it out for whatever reason, that's fine. But I'm working on a great big pile of wood here, just trying to get all the boards as flat as I can. And I can get that cupping out of there simply by working the planer back and forth, you know, with what I need to cut out of there. That's another reason why I cut them an inch thick, and I do not try to plane a lot off of it each time, because if you do, you might end up with not enough wood left over to get yourself a flat board, okay? The board stopped moving in the middle because the cup in the middle of the board is less than it is at the ends. Okay, so if you look here, you can see that the planer only hit the board about a foot or so in there, and then it hit about 2 feet at the other end. In the middle it wasn't hitting because the board's flatter. So it's not science. You can't tell what each board's going to do. Now, if I could cut without hurting the planer 1/8 of an inch or even 1/4 of an inch, then it would be a different story. I'd just run it through and be done with it. But because I'm working with a small planer, I don't want to destroy it. I'm taking my time with it so that I can get every board to look nice and flat. flat on the bottom, but the top is still has some evidence of cup on it. So I'm going to run it through with the way I have it sitting there, and that'll cut that top flat, and by the time I get to 3/4 of an inch, I'll have a nice board. Now the bottom of this board is planed all the way down, and you can see that it's pretty flat, okay? So now the top of the board, it's not bad, it looks flat. The problem with it is that is straighter than what, you know, you can use a piece of wood for. So on this edge, on this side, there's a little bit of wood that hasn't been planed. But I'm also, and this is the key, I'm not down to 3/4 of an inch yet. So I can run it through one more time with this face up, and I'll end up with a totally planed, nice looking board. I don't really understand what people have a problem with when it comes to the way I'm planing this, other than, you know, the tool might be too small. But as far as the technique, I have flat boards, so that's the key. That's what we're after. Guys, one other thing I wanted to show you. You see that log right there that has the bark off of it? That's a maple log. And the maple log came from right next to the stream down where they're supposedly putting a new bridge on my road. And you can see that in the springtime here, that thing was sucking up so much water through the cambium layer that when they went to grab the log and put it onto the truck, they were using a thumb on a track hoe. You can see that they tore the bark and the whole bark came off. I have 2 more logs like that up in the other pile. All the bark just fell right off of it because there was so much water in springtime here going through the log or through the tree before it became a log.